You know that feeling when the house is quiet and the only voice talking to you is coming from a screen. For millions of kids, that wasn't just a feeling. That was every single day after school for years. They'd walk in, lock the door behind them, grab the remote, and for the next 4 or 5 hours, the television raised them. And nobody really talked about what that does to a kid's brain. Not then. Not for a long time after. They're the ones who can't fall asleep without background noise. The ones who feel weirdly homesick for fictional characters. The adults who still binge-watch not because they're lazy, but because silence makes them uncomfortable in a way they can't quite explain. And here is what nobody tells you. The psychology behind it goes way deeper than just too much screen time. Because these kids didn't just watch television, they formed relationships with it. Real ones. Picture this. It is 1987. You are 8 years old. You let yourself in with the key around your neck. The house is empty. Mom's at work. Dad's either gone or at work too. There is a note on the fridge. Snacks are in the cabinet. No smartphone. No internet. No way for anyone to check on you. So you turn on the television, and suddenly you are not alone anymore. The characters show up at the same time every day. They're consistent. They're predictable. They never leave. By the mid-'80s, researchers estimated around 7 million children in America were coming home to empty houses every day. And here is what is fascinating. What happened next wasn't just passive watching. It was something psychologists call a parasocial relationship. Horton and Wohl first described it back in 1956. It is when you form a one-sided emotional bond with someone who doesn't know you exist. But for these kids, it wasn't one-sided in the way it sounds. These characters were their after-school companions. Their emotional anchors. Mr. Rogers looked into the camera and said, "You are special." And for a kid alone in an empty house, that landed differently. It wasn't entertainment. It was the closest thing to emotional attunement they had between 3:30 and whenever somebody came home. And that brings us to the first thing nobody talks about. Emotional regulation. Most kids learn to manage their emotions through co-regulation. That is the fancy term for having a calm adult nearby who helps you process what you are feeling. But when the adult isn't there, or when they're too stressed or distracted, the kid finds something else to regulate with. Television becomes the co-regulator. Predictable rhythms, familiar voices, laugh tracks that tell you when things are okay. Psychologists call it affect regulation through external stimulation. But in plain English, it means these kids learn to calm themselves down with noise. And that is why, decades later, they still can't handle silence. The quiet doesn't feel peaceful to them. It feels like being abandoned all over again. But here is the thing. It goes deeper than just needing background noise. The second pattern is something researchers noticed in the early 2000s. Kids raised on heavy television developed what is called a parasocial attachment style. Basically, they got really good at feeling connected to people who couldn't actually connect back. Characters, hosts, voices on a screen. And that pattern followed them everywhere. They're the adults who feel closer to podcast hosts than to their actual neighbors. The ones who can describe a fictional character's emotional arc better than their best friend's actual problems. Not because they don't care, because they were trained to bond at a distance. And there is this weird paradox. They crave connection, but they're most comfortable when there is a screen between them and the other person. Texting feels safer than talking. Watching someone's story feels more intimate than asking them how they're doing, and they don't always know why. Now here is where it gets complicated. The third pattern. These kids didn't just learn to regulate with television, they learned to narrate with it. Television taught them story structure before school ever did. Beginning, middle, end, conflict, resolution, problem, lesson, laugh track. So they became incredible storytellers. Funny, sharp. Great at reading a room because they spent years studying how rooms work on screens. But underneath that performance is something quieter. Psychologists call it a false self, a concept Winnicott described decades ago. It is the version of you that learned exactly how to behave. By watching thousands of hours of people performing emotions on camera, you learned what sadness is supposed to look like, what anger sounds like, what love does in Act 3. But you might have learned the performance before you learned the feeling. And that gap between performing an emotion and actually feeling it, that stays with you. And here is what is fascinating. There is a fourth layer that almost nobody discusses. Television didn't just teach these kids how to feel. It taught them what to expect from people. In sitcoms, every conflict resolves in 22 minutes. Every misunderstanding gets cleared up before the credits roll. Every family loves each other by the end. So when real relationships didn't follow that script, when conflicts dragged on for days or people just left without a resolution, it felt broken. Not just hard, actually broken. Like the episode glitched and nobody wrote the ending. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that heavy childhood television viewing correlated with what they called scripted social expectations. Basically, kids internalized television logic as social logic. And when the real world didn't follow the script, they didn't know how to improvise. They became adults who leave when things get messy. Not because they're avoidant exactly, but because nobody ever showed them what staying through the uncomfortable part actually looks like. In real life, there is no laugh track to tell you the awkward moment is fine. There is no swelling music to tell you the hard conversation was worth it. But here is the part that actually matters, and this is where it turns. Because recognizing the pattern is the first step to rewriting it. And these television-raised kids, they actually have some remarkable strengths that came from the same place as the wounds. They have extraordinary emotional vocabularies. Years of watching complex characters navigate loss, joy, betrayal, forgiveness. They're deeply empathetic because they spent their childhoods practicing perspective-taking, without even knowing it. Every time they wondered why a character did what they did, that was empathy training. And that parasocial bonding they learned, it is actually the same skill that makes them incredible at connecting through writing, through art, through any medium where you reach people at a distance. The thing that felt like a deficit is actually a superpower in disguise. They just need to learn to use it with real people too. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth. The idea that adaptation to difficult circumstances doesn't just leave scars, it builds capacities you wouldn't have developed otherwise. But the growth only happens when you see the pattern clearly, when you stop calling it laziness or antisocial behavior and start seeing it for what it actually was. A kid, alone in a house, doing the best they could with what they had, and what they had was a screen that never turned them away. That is not a failure. That is not damage. That is a child solving an impossible problem with the only tool available. And if that is your story, if you grew up with the television as your most consistent companion, you are not broken. You are someone who learned emotional complexity from stories before you learned it from people. And now you get to do both. The silence doesn't have to feel like abandonment. It can just be silence, and you can learn to sit in it. It takes practice. It takes patience with yourself. But you've already done harder things than this. You sat in empty houses and made them feel full. You turned strangers on screens into something that felt like family. That took something. And whatever that something is, it is still in you. If this hit home for you, if you saw yourself somewhere in this, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support. And hey, it is okay to turn it off sometimes. The quiet is waiting for you, and it is kinder than you think.